when 28-year-old Sarah Mitchell signed the auction papers for a corroded Vietnam-era helicopter that hadn't flown in 40 years. Her neighbors called it the final proof she'd lost her mind. But locked inside the aircraft's sealed maintenance compartment lay evidence of a military cover-up that would expose a decorated general's war crimes and restore honor to dozens of soldiers wrongfully branded as cowards and deserters. For beneath layers of rust and abandonment, this forgotten machine carried testimony that powerful forces had spent half a century trying to erase. Before we dive into this incredible story, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow, I've got something even more powerful lined up for you. The late afternoon sun hung low over the Riverside County government surplus auction yard, casting long shadows across rows of decommissioned military equipment that stretched toward the distant San Bernardino Mountains. It was the kind of place where history came to die, where machines that had once served their country now sat rusting under the unforgiving California sun, waiting to be reduced to scrap metal and recycled into something more useful for the modern world. Sarah Mitchell stood near the back of the crowd, a folding chair auction catalog clutched in her hands, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that did nothing to soften the exhaustion evident in her face. At 28, she looked older, the way people do when life has piled on more responsibility than years. The shadows under her eyes spoke of too many double shifts at Mercy General Hospital's emergency room, too many nights sitting vigil beside a hospital bed, too many hours spent caring for someone she loved while watching them slowly slip away. The auctioneer, a weathered man in his 60s with a voice seasoned by decades of selling everything from farm equipment to foreclosed homes, gestured toward lot number 47 with the enthusiasm of someone who knew he was trying to sell something nobody wanted. All right, folks, next up we have one Bell UH-1 Iroquois helicopter, commonly known as the Huey, manufactured 1968, serial number 68-15724, decommissioned 1982, stored at various military facilities, perdition as is, non-operational salvage. Real piece of Vietnam War history here, folks. He paused, scanning the crowd of about 30 people, mostly scrap metal dealers, military memorabilia collectors, and the perpetually curious who showed up to these auctions hoping to find buried treasure among the government's cast-offs. Let's start the bidding at $10,000. Do I hear 10? Silence. The helicopter sat on the tarmac like a monument to forgotten conflicts, its once olive drab paint faded to a mottled grey-green, streaked with rust that bled down its sides like old wounds. The rotor blades drooped at awkward angles, secured with chains to prevent movement. The plexiglass windows were clouded with decades of grime and desert dust. To the untrained eye, it looked like exactly what the auctioneer had called it, salvage. How about 5,000? Anyone want to start at 5? More silence, broken by a few murmurs and the distant sound of traffic on the interstate. Then, from the front row, came a bark of laughter. Jack Brennan, owner of Brennan's Industrial Salvage and the man who dominated the auction so far, acquiring 6 lots of military surplus without any competition, turned to address the crowd with the confidence of someone who'd been coming to these auctions for 20 years. "Bob, nobody's paying $5,000 for that rust bucket. Thing probably hasn't run since Reagan was president." More laughter from the crowd. The scrap value might be worth 2, maybe 3,000 if you're lucky, and that's after you pay to have it cut up and hauled away. Brennan was a large man in his mid-50s, with the kind of build that suggested he'd been athletic once, but had let success soften him. He wore expensive work boots, designer jeans, and a polo shirt with his company logo embroidered on the chest, the uniform of a man who'd moved from working with his hands to managing those who did. "You might be right, Jack," the auctioneer conceded with a practiced chuckle, "but I've got to give it a try." "All right, Let's make this easy. I'll start at 4,000. Do I hear 4? Sarah's hand went up. The movement was small, almost hesitant, but in the silence of the moment, it might as well have been a thunderclap. Every head in the crowd turned toward her. 4,000 to the young lady in the back. Do I hear 5? Jack Brennan twisted in his seat, squinting at Sarah with a mixture of surprise and something that might have been concern. Miss, I don't know if you know what you're bidding on, but that helicopter is worthless except for scrap. You'd be throwing away your money. Several people nodded in agreement. A man in a faded baseball cap called out, Lady, that thing hasn't flown in 40 years. It's a lawn ornament at best. Sarah felt her face flush, but she kept her hand raised. She'd expected skepticism. She'd prepared for it. What she hadn't prepared for was the weight of 30 pairs of eyes judging her, questioning her sanity, her intelligence, her right to be here. 4,000 going once, the auctioneer continued, clearly pleased to have any bid at all. 4-5, Brennan called out suddenly, still watching Sarah with an intensity that felt less like competition and more like scrutiny. Sarah's throat went dry. She had exactly $8,400 in her checking account, accumulated over 2 years of picking up every extra shift she could manage, of saying no to dinners out with friends, of wearing scrubs until they were threadbare, and driving a 2003 Honda Civic that burned oil and made ominous sounds whenever she accelerated past 60 miles per hour. That money was supposed to be for a down payment on a reliable car, something that wouldn't leave her stranded on the way to work, or worse, on the way to an emergency. But the number painted on that helicopter's tail section, barely visible under decades of weathering and neglect, was 68 to 15724, and that number was written in her grandfather's journal. 5,000, Sarah heard herself say, her voice steadier than she felt. The crowd erupted in murmurs. Someone laughed outright. A woman near the front whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "More money than sense." Brennan stood up from his chair, turning to face Sarah directly. His expression had shifted from amusement to something harder to read, somewhere between concern and warning. "Miss, I don't know what you think you're going to do with that helicopter, but trust me, you're making a mistake. I'll tell you what, I'll go 6,000, and that's more than it's worth. I'm trying to help you out here." "Miss Mitchell, is it?" he said, reading her name from the paperwork visible on the desk. "I wanted to apologize if I came across as aggressive out there. I just hate to see people make expensive mistakes." "It's fine," Sarah said, gathering her documents and preparing to leave. "The thing is," Brennan continued, moving to partially block the door, not aggressively, but enough to make it clear he wanted to finish the conversation, "I'm still interested in that helicopter. I know you paid more than it's worth, and I'd hate to see you stuck with something you can't use. So here's what I'll do. I'll give you 9,000 for it right now. That's a $600 profit for about 30 minutes of your time. You can walk away, buy that reliable car you clearly need, and forget this whole thing ever happened." Sarah studied him. He was smiling, but it didn't reach his eyes. There was something in his posture, in the careful way he was watching her, that set off alarm bells honed by years of working in an ER, where reading people quickly could mean the difference between preventing violence and getting caught in it. "How did you know I need a car?" she asked quietly. Brennan blinked. "What? I never mentioned needing a car. The clerk just did, but you said it first. That reliable car you clearly need. How did you know?" A flicker of something crossed his face, too quick to identify. "I just assumed. Your Honda in the parking lot looks like it's on its last legs. Simple observation. You noticed my specific car in a lot with about 40 vehicles." The silence stretched between them. The clerk pretended to be absorbed in her computer screen. "Look," Brennan said, his friendly mask slipping slightly, "I'm trying to do you a favor here. That helicopter is worthless except for scrap, and even then it's barely worth what you paid. But I collect military surplus, and I'm willing to take the loss to add it to my collection. 9,000. Final offer. You'd be smart to take it. Sarah stepped around him toward the door. Thanks, but I'm not interested in selling. His hand shot out, not grabbing her but placing itself against the doorframe, creating a barrier. Miss Mitchell, I don't think you understand what you're getting into. Old military equipment like that, there are regulations, environmental concerns, disposal requirements. It's a legal headache waiting to happen. Let me take it off your hands before you end up with problems you can't handle. Remove your arm, please, Sarah said firmly, her ER voice coming through, the one she used with aggressive drunks and belligerent relatives. Brennan held her gaze for another moment before slowly lowering his arm. You're making a mistake, he said, his tone shifting from friendly to cold. A big one. Don't say I didn't warn you. As Sarah pushed past him and out of the trailer, she heard him say one more thing. People who dig into old military business sometimes find out there were good reasons to leave it buried. She didn't turn around, but the words followed her across the parking lot to where her oil-burning Honda sat waiting, a car that might die any day now, leaving her with no transportation and no savings to replace it. What had she done? The drive from Riverside to Redlands took 45 minutes in good traffic, but the late afternoon rush hour stretched it to over an hour. Sarah spent the entire drive second-guessing herself, mentally calculating how much debt she'd just put herself in once she factored in towing costs, the inevitable car replacement she'd need, the regular bills that didn't care about emotional promises made to dying grandparents. Her phone rang 3 times during the drive, twice from numbers she didn't recognize, which she ignored, and once from her best friend Kimberly, which she also ignored because she couldn't face explaining what she'd just done. The property that had been her grandfather's and was now hers sat at the end of a long dirt road off Highway 38, 20 acres of scrubland dotted with Joshua trees and the remnants of her grandfather's various projects and hobbies accumulated over decades of living alone. The house itself was a modest ranch-style structure built in the 1970s, sun-faded and in need of repairs Sarah couldn't afford, surrounded by several outbuildings in various states of decay. Sarah parked in the driveway and sat for a moment, staring at the house where she'd spent countless childhood weekends, back when her grandfather had been healthy and happy, before her grandmother's death. Before the drinking started, before whatever had been haunting him decided to make itself known in the ravings of cancer-induced delirium. No, not delirium. She'd read the journal. Those entries were clear, detailed, written by a man who'd carried a burden for 53 years and finally decided it was too heavy to take to the grave. Inside the house, Sarah went directly to her grandfather's study, a small room that smelled of old paper and the pipe tobacco he'd quit smoking 20 years ago, but whose scent had soaked into the wood and never quite left. The desk stood against the far wall, ancient oak that had survived 2 moves and countless years of use. She pulled open the bottom drawer and removed the journal, its green cloth cover worn soft with age. Staff Sergeant Robert Bobby Chen, United States Army, had filled this journal methodically over 3 years, from 1968 to 1971, documenting his service in Vietnam. Most of it was mundane, the kind of daily observations any soldier might make. The weather, the food, letters from home, minor complaints about officers and equipment. But one section, marked with a faded red ribbon, was different. Sarah opened to that section now, reading entries she'd already read a dozen times since her grandfather's death, looking for anything she might have missed. November 7th, 1968. Today I witnessed something that I know I'm not supposed to talk about. Colonel Ashford ordered us to report that Captain Webb's helicopter was shot down by enemy fire during an extraction mission, but that's not what happened. I was on perimeter security at LZ Falcon when Webb's Huey came in. He wasn't shot down. He landed hot and fast, and immediately started yelling for someone to help him get his crew chief off the helicopter. The crew chief had been shot, but not by the VC. Webb was screaming that Colonel Ashford had ordered him to fire on a civilian village that was clearly displaying white surrender flags. Webb had refused. The colonel, who was riding as a passenger on the mission, had pulled his sidearm and shot the crew chief when the man tried to interfere. Then Ashford threatened to shoot Webb too if he didn't follow orders. Webb flew away instead. He came back to base to report what happened, to get help for his crew chief, but Colonel Ashford got there first. By the time Webb landed, Ashford had already filed a report claiming Webb had abandoned his post under fire, refused a direct order during combat, and endangered his crew through cowardice. Within an hour, MPs arrested Webb. His crew chief died before we could get him to a field hospital. It's scheduled to be auctioned by Riverside County in September. I won't live that long. Sarah graduates from nursing school in July. She's young, she's brave in ways I never was, and she deserves to know why her grandfather has been such a mess for her entire life. Why I drank, why I couldn't keep a marriage together, why I wake up screaming sometimes. I'm going to tell her everything. I'm going to give her this journal, and I'm going to ask her to finish what I was too coward to start. God forgive me for putting this burden on her, but someone needs to know the truth. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she read her grandfather's confession. He'd tracked that helicopter for years, waiting for his chance at redemption, only to run out of time. Now that chance was hers, and she'd just spent every dollar she had to seize it. A sound outside made her freeze. A vehicle was coming up the driveway, tires crunching on gravel. She moved to the window and peered out through the dusty blinds. A black SUV with tinted windows, not a vehicle she recognized. Sarah's heart rate picked up. The auction had been just a few hours ago. No one should know she was here. She hadn't given the auction house this address, just a phone number. The SUV stopped, and two men got out. One was older, maybe 60, with silver hair and the bearing of someone used to being in charge. The other was younger, athletically built, wearing sunglasses despite the approaching sunset. They walked toward the house with the confidence of people who knew exactly where they were going. Sarah quickly moved away from the window, her mind racing. She should call the police. And tell them what? That two men she didn't know had driven up to her property. That wasn't illegal. Maybe they were lost. Maybe they were selling something. Maybe they were here because she'd just bought a helicopter that someone didn't want her to have. The doorbell rang, its chime echoing through the quiet house. Sarah stood frozen in her grandfather's study, the journal still in her hands, her phone in her pocket. The doorbell rang again, followed by a firm knock. "Miss Mitchell," a deep voice called through the door. "My name is Richard Thornton. I represent certain interests that would like to discuss your recent purchase. I promise this will only take a moment of your time." Sarah didn't answer. She moved quietly toward the back of the house, toward the kitchen door that led to the backyard and the property beyond. "Miss Mitchell, I know you're home. Your car is in the driveway. Please, there's no need for alarm. We simply want to have a conversation about a mutually beneficial arrangement." The doorknob rattled slightly, testing whether it was locked. It was. "Miss Mitchell, I'm authorized to offer you $15,000 for the helicopter you purchased today. That's nearly double what you paid. You'd come out well ahead, and you could avoid any complications that might arise from keeping it. $15,000. More than enough to replace her car and still have a cushion. More than she'd ever had in her savings account at one time. But Jack Brennan had offered $9,000 just hours ago, and these men were offering $15,000. which meant someone thought that helicopter was worth a lot more than scrap metal, which meant her grandfather had been right. Miss Mitchell, I'd really prefer we handle this in a civilized manner, but I should mention that old military equipment is subject to numerous regulations. Environmental Protection Agency regulations, Department of Defense property disposal protocols, transportation and storage restrictions. It would be unfortunate if various regulatory agencies suddenly became concerned about your compliance with all those requirements. The fines alone could be financially devastating. The threat was clear even through the polite language. Sarah reached the back door and quietly unlocked it. Miss Mitchell, she slipped out into the backyard just as she heard the sound of a window breaking at the front of the house. They weren't waiting for her permission anymore. Sarah ran. Part 1 continues to next section due to length constraints. The property stretched 20 acres toward the foothills, mostly scrubland and Joshua trees, with scattered boulders providing cover. Sarah knew every inch of it from childhood exploring, which gave her an advantage as twilight deepened into true darkness. She could hear the men behind her, moving more carefully than she was, probably worried about snakes or turning an ankle in the rough terrain. One of them was on a phone, his voice carrying across the quiet desert air. "Yes, sir," she ran. "No, we've got it covered. There's nowhere for her to go out here." Sarah crouched behind a large boulder, trying to control her breathing, her mind racing. She needed to get help, but her phone signal was weak out here, 1 or 2 bars at best. She pulled it out, the screen's glow making her feel dangerously visible, and called 911. The call connected, but the signal was breaking up. 911, what's your emergency? There are men, broke into my house. Property off Highway 38, Mitchell property. Ma'am, you're breaking up. Can you repeat? The signal dropped entirely. Sarah cursed under her breath and tried again. Nothing, no signal at all. The sound of footsteps was getting closer. She could see flashlight beams cutting through the darkness, sweeping systematically across the landscape. "Miss Mitchell," the older man's voice called out, "this is ridiculous. We're not going to hurt you. We just want to talk business. $30,000 for the helicopter. Final offer. You can walk away from all of this right now. 30,000. The number kept climbing, which meant she'd stumbled into something far bigger than she'd imagined. Sarah needed to get to the neighbor's property, about half a mile west. Old Mr. Patterson had been her grandfather's friend for 40 years. He'd help her. She moved as quietly as she could, using the terrain for cover, working her way west. Behind her the voices continued. "Track her phone GPS. Need authorization for that. Just find her. The client wants this handled tonight." 20 minutes of careful movement brought Sarah to the property line, marked by a barbed wire fence she'd climbed countless times as a kid. She was just about to cross it when a light pinned her from behind. There, Sarah ran, not bothering with stealth anymore, heading for Patterson's house, visible as a porch light in the distance. She could hear the men behind her, younger and faster, gaining ground. She wasn't going to make it. A gunshot cracked across the desert air, and Sarah dove instinctively, hitting the ground hard. Her phone flew from her hand, landing somewhere in the scrub brush. "Warning shot," one of the men yelled. "Next one won't be." Sarah lay still, her heart hammering, every scenario running through her mind. This couldn't be happening. She'd bought a helicopter at an auction. That was all. How had it escalated to men with guns chasing her across the desert? "Miss Mitchell, get up slowly, hands where we can see them." She stood slowly, raising her hands. The 2 men approached, the younger one holding a pistol pointed at the ground but ready. Up close, the older man looked even more like someone used to power.
Expensive clothes, confident posture, the kind of calm that comes from always getting what you want.
Captain Webb had that courage. He refused an illegal order, even though he knew it would cost him everything. And it did cost him everything. His career, his freedom, his reputation, his life. I hope Sarah has the courage I lacked. I hope she's braver than her grandfather was, because this truth deserves to see daylight, even if it's dangerous to bring it there. Some things are worth the risk. Sarah closed her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Tomorrow the helicopter would be delivered to her grandfather's property. Tomorrow she'd have to decide whether to fight or surrender. Tomorrow everything would change. But tonight, lying in the darkness of a borrowed room, Sarah Mitchell made a choice. She pulled up the contact information for every investigative journalist she could find, every veterans advocacy group, every military justice organization. She started drafting emails, documenting everything that had happened. If these people wanted to silence her, they'd have to work harder than broken windows and threats. Because her grandfather had carried this burden alone for 53 years, and she'd be damned if she'd let him die, believing no one cared enough to finish what he'd started. The helicopter was being delivered at 10 a.m., and Sarah was going to find whatever evidence was hidden inside it, no matter what it cost her. Some things were worth the risk, some promises were worth keeping, and some truths, no matter how dangerous, deserved to see the light. The midday sun would beat down on Riverside County as the flatbed trailer, carrying Huey 68 15724, made its way toward 20 acres of scrubland, where a 28-year-old nurse waited to uncover secrets that powerful people had spent 50 years burying. Sarah Mitchell had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. The laughter from the auction yard had faded, replaced by something far more dangerous, the attention of people who killed to keep their secrets safe. But locked inside that rusted helicopter, sealed away in maintenance compartments untouched for decades, lay evidence that would expose war crimes, restore stolen honor, and prove that sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't money or property. It's the truth, no matter how dangerous it is to claim it. What Sarah would discover in the coming hours would set in motion events that would shake the military establishment, expose a decorated general's darkest secrets, and prove that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's keeping your promises even when everything tells you to run. The game had begun, and there was no turning back now. The morning sun was already brutal by 9:30 a.m., when Sarah stood in her grandfather's driveway, watching the flatbed trailer navigate the narrow dirt road with painful slowness. Behind the truck, a small convoy had formed, Mr. Patterson in his pickup, keeping watch like a protective uncle, Kimberly in her Subaru, refusing to let Sarah face this alone after hearing everything that had happened, and a sheriff's deputy in a marked patrol car, assigned to maintain presence after last night's break-in. What the deputy didn't know was that Sarah had also contacted someone else. Marcus Chen, no relation to her grandfather, was an investigative journalist for ProPublica who specialized in military cover-ups and veterans issues. Sarah had found his contact information at 2 a.m., sent him everything from her grandfather's journal via encrypted email, and received a response within 20 minutes. "I'm in Los Angeles. I can be there by noon. Don't let anyone take that helicopter until I arrive." The flatbed finally pulled into the clearing beside her grandfather's largest outbuilding, a weathered metal structure that had once housed farm equipment, but now sat mostly empty. The driver, a weathered man named Luis, who'd been sympathetic when Sarah explained she needed the helicopter, placed carefully rather than just dumped, expertly maneuvered the trailer into position. "Where you want it, miss," Luis called from the cab. "Inside the building if possible, under cover." Luis nodded and spent the next 20 minutes using the truck's hydraulic lift and a surprising amount of skill to position the rusted Huey inside the structure, its drooping rotor blades barely clearing the doorway. When the helicopter finally settled onto the concrete floor with a groan of protesting metal, Sarah felt an almost physical shock of reality. This was real. She'd actually done this, spent her life savings on a 56-year-old military helicopter based on her dying grandfather's journal entries, and now standing before the actual aircraft in the harsh morning light, it looked even worse than it had at the auction. Rust had eaten through sections of the fuselage. The tail boom showed stress fractures. The plexiglass windows were so clouded with grime that seeing inside was nearly impossible. Parts were missing entirely. The seats had been removed, along with what looked like weapons mounts and various internal components. "Jesus," Sarah Kimberly breathed, walking slowly around the machine. "This thing looks like it belongs in a junkyard. Are you absolutely sure about this?" Sarah didn't answer. She was studying the helicopter's side door, which stood partially open, revealing a dark interior that smelled of old metal, hydraulic fluid, and decades of abandonment. "Miss Mitchell, this is incredible," he said finally. "If even half of what you're telling me is verifiable, this is one of the biggest military justice stories in decades. General James Ashford is currently advising the Pentagon on ethics policy. He's written 3 best-selling books on military honor. He's testified before Congress. If he's actually guilty of war crimes and framing an innocent officer, then a lot of people are going to want this buried," Kimberly finished grimly. "Which is exactly why we need to document everything," Chen said. He positioned his camera to capture the panel clearly. "All right, Mr. Patterson, whenever you're ready, and for the record, please state your name, the date, and what you're about to do." Mr. Patterson cleared his throat. "David Patterson, June 16, 2025. I'm about to open a sealed military maintenance compartment on helicopter serial number 68-15724 at the request of Sarah Mitchell, granddaughter of Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, who documented events related to this aircraft in November 1968. He resumed working on the fasteners. Each one required careful manipulation, and there were 6 in total. The first 4 came loose with squealing protests of old metal. The 5th fought him for 10 minutes before finally yielding. As he worked on the 6th and final fastener, Sarah became aware of another sound, a vehicle approaching on the dirt road. "Someone's coming," Kimberly said, moving to the building's entrance. Sarah's stomach tightened. "Mr. Chen, you might want to work faster." "Almost got it," Patterson grunted, applying more force to the stubborn fastener. The vehicle came into view, a black SUV, identical to the one from last night. "It's them," Sarah said, her voice tight. Chen immediately switched his camera to continuous recording mode and positioned it to capture both the helicopter and the entrance. "Keep working. I'm documenting everything that happens." The SUV stopped, and 3 men emerged. Richard Thornton, his younger associate from last night, and a third man Sarah didn't recognize, older, maybe 70, with military bearing despite civilian clothes. They approached the building with the confidence of people who expected no resistance. "Miss Mitchell," Thornton called out, "I see you've decided to ignore our generous offer and our reasonable warnings. That's unfortunate." Sarah stepped into the doorway, blocking their view of the interior. "This is private property. You're trespassing." We're here to collect government property that was illegally sold at auction, the older man said, his voice carrying authority. I'm Colonel William Hayes, U.S. Army, retired. That helicopter contains classified materials that should never have been released to civilian hands. I'm authorized to reclaim it. Authorized by who? Chen asked, stepping into view with his camera clearly recording. Hayes's eyes narrowed. And you are? Marcus Chen, ProPublica. I'm a journalist covering this story. Care to explain what classified materials are in a 56-year-old helicopter that the military sold as scrap? That's not your concern. This is a matter of national security. Behind them, inside the helicopter, there was a metallic click as the final fastener came free. Got it, Patterson said quietly. Hayes heard it. His expression shifted from authoritative to alarmed. Do not open that compartment. That is a direct order. I don't take orders from you, Patterson replied calmly. I'm a civilian on private property. Hayes moved toward the building. Thornton and his associate followed. Sarah stood her ground, her heart hammering. Mr. Chen, she called out without taking her eyes off the approaching men. Are you getting all this? Every word, including a retired army colonel attempting to illegally confiscate private property while claiming national security. Hayes stopped, clearly realizing he was being recorded. Turn that camera off. Not a chance, Chen replied. First Amendment. I have every right to document what happens on this property with the owner's permission. A standoff developed at the building entrance. Hayes, Thornton and the younger man on one side, Sarah, Kimberly and Chen on the other. And inside the helicopter, Mr. Patterson, carefully lifting the panel away. There's something here, Patterson's voice carried from inside. Sealed bags, multiple items. Looks like papers, tape reels, photographs. Do not remove those materials, Hayes commanded, his voice rising. They are classified government property. Removing them is a federal crime. Really? Chen said, his journalist's instinct for a story in full force. Because according to the auction documents Miss Mitchell has, this helicopter was legally sold as surplus, with no restrictions or classified material noted. If there are classified materials in it, that suggests someone in the military improperly disposed of classified information. That's a different crime entirely. Hayes' face reddened. You have no idea what you're interfering with. Then explain it to me, Chen challenged. On camera, tell me why a 56-year-old helicopter contains materials important enough that you'd break into a civilian's home, fire weapons at her, and threaten her. Tell me what's in there that's so sensitive. I'm removing the items, Patterson called out. They're sealed in what looks like military evidence bags. Labels are partially legible. Says Flight 68, 15724, November 7th, 1968. Maintenance logs, radio recordings, witness statements. Hayes made a move toward the building. The younger man with Thornton reached into his jacket. Don't even think about it, Kimberly said sharply. She'd moved to Mr. Patterson's truck and returned with his shotgun. This is private property, and you've been told to leave. The younger man froze, hand still inside his jacket. The situation balanced on a knife edge. Sarah said quietly, you don't have to. Yes, I do. These assholes threatened my best friend, broke into her house, and now they're trying to steal from her. They can get the hell off this property, or explain to the sheriff why they're trespassing while armed. Chen kept his camera rolling. For the record, can you identify yourselves and explain your legal authority to be here? Hayes's jaw worked silently for a moment. Then he pulled out his phone. I'm calling for federal marshals. This is a matter for the FBI now. Good idea, Chen agreed.
While you're at it, I'll call my editor and the lawyers at ProPublica. I'm sure they'd love to hear about retired military officers attempting to suppress evidence of potential war crimes. War crimes? Hayes's expression shifted from angry to alarmed. What are you talking about? November 7th, 1968, Sarah said, finding her voice stronger than she expected. Captain Marcus Webb, illegal order to fire on civilians. When he refused, Colonel James Ashford shot the crew chief and framed Webb for cowardice. My grandfather witnessed it all, and the evidence is in that helicopter. The color drained from Hayes's face. For the first time he looked uncertain. Ashford, he muttered. Then, louder, you have no proof of these accusations. We're about to, Patterson said, emerging from the helicopter carefully carrying a large sealed bag. Inside, visible through the clear plastic, were papers, what looked like reel-to-reel tapes, and photographs. Chen immediately focused his camera on the bag, zooming in to capture the labels and contents clearly. Can you read the label for the camera, Mr. Patterson? Patterson held it up. Evidence bag, sealed November 9th, 1968. Contents, flight recorder tapes, radio transmission recordings, maintenance logs, witness statements, and photographs relating to incident date November 7th, 1968, aircraft 68, 15724, sealed by order of Major General Harold Westwick, investigating officer. Westwick was the division commander, Hayes said weakly. He died in 1985. Convenient, Chen observed. And this evidence was never presented at Captain Webb's court-martial. Webb was guilty, Hayes insisted, but his conviction was fading. He abandoned his post under fire. Then you won't mind if we examine this evidence, Sarah said. If it proves Webb was guilty, then he was guilty. But if it proves he was framed. Hayes looked at the sealed bag, at Chen's camera, at Sarah's determined expression.
Sarah Mitchell sat in the front row beside Rebecca Webb Martinez, who clutched a photograph of her father in his Army uniform, taken in 1967 before everything went wrong. At the podium, a three-star general read from a formal document. After extensive review of newly discovered evidence, the United States Army finds that Captain Marcus James Webb was wrongfully convicted of cowardice, dereliction of duty, and related charges in November 1968. The conviction is hereby vacated, and Captain Webb is posthumously exonerated of all charges. Furthermore, Captain Webb is posthumously promoted to Major and awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism in refusing an illegal order and protecting innocent civilians at great personal cost. Rebecca began to cry silently. Sarah took her hand. The general continued. The Army extends its deepest apologies to Major Webb's family for this profound injustice. Major Webb's name will be inscribed on the memorial wall with full honors, and his military benefits and honors are fully restored. Applause erupted, despite the formal setting. Rebecca stood, clutching the photograph, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered to Sarah. "Thank you for giving me back my father." Sarah thought of her grandfather, wished he could have lived to see this moment. Outside the courtroom, Marcus Chen was doing interviews for the documentary about the case. General James Ashford had resigned in disgrace 3 weeks ago, his books pulled from shelves, his consulting contracts canceled. Federal investigators were reviewing other operations he'd been involved in, looking for similar cover-ups. The helicopter sat in a military museum now, preserved as evidence of how truth persists even when buried. School groups toured past it, learning about courage and justice and the importance of speaking up. And Sarah Mitchell, who'd been laughed at for spending her savings on rust, had become a symbol of individual courage challenging institutional power. Job offers had flooded in, But she'd returned to her ER nursing job, using the settlement money from the government to finish paying off her student loans and helping other families of wrongfully accused veterans. Some nights she still pulled out her grandfather's journal and read his entries. "I hope Sarah has the courage I lacked," he'd written. She did, Grandpa Bobby, Sarah thought. She did. And in doing so, she'd proved that sometimes the most important purchases aren't made with money, but with courage. That sometimes the most valuable inheritances aren't property or wealth, but truth and justice. That rusty old helicopter everyone laughed at had changed everything, just like her grandfather knew it would. Part 3. The Backlash. 6 weeks after Captain Marcus Webb's posthumous exoneration ceremony, Sarah Mitchell discovered that justice, even when served, comes with a price tag that extends far beyond money. The threatening text messages had evolved into something more sophisticated and far more dangerous. Her bank accounts had been frozen twice due to suspicious activity that investigations proved baseless but took weeks to resolve. Her license had been challenged with anonymous complaints alleging drug diversion and patient abuse, all proven false but requiring exhausting investigations and legal fees. Her car had been vandalized 3 times, and most disturbingly, someone had accessed her medical records and leaked them online, violating HIPAA laws but causing immense personal embarrassment when her history of anxiety medication and therapy after her grandfather's death became public fodder. Sarah sat in the waiting room of Baxter & Simmons, a prominent Washington, D.C. law firm, watching rain streak down the floor-to-ceiling windows. Beside her sat Marcus Chen, who'd become not just her journalist contact, but something of a protective older brother figure throughout this ordeal. Across from them, Rebecca Webb Martinez nervously twisted her father's posthumous Distinguished Service Cross medal between her fingers. "They're trying to break you," Chen said quietly, not for the first time. "Everything that's happened in the last 6 weeks, the bank freezes, the license challenges, the harassment, it's coordinated. Someone with resources and connections is systematically trying to destroy your life." "I know," she replied, her voice flat with exhaustion. She'd barely slept in weeks, jumping at every sound, checking over her shoulder constantly, living in a state of perpetual hypervigilance that was destroying her mental health, despite the therapy she'd resumed. "The question is whether we can prove it, and whether proving it matters if they can just keep coming at us through different channels." The door to the conference room opened, and a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s emerged. Catherine Simmons, senior partner and one of the most feared civil rights attorneys in the country, had agreed to take their case pro bono after reading Marcus Chen's investigative series. "They're ready for us," Simmons said, her expression unreadable. Inside the conference room, 4 people waited. 2 Sarah recognized from television: Senator Patricia Morrison, chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and Congressman David Walsh, ranking member of the House Veterans Affairs Committee. The other 2 introduced themselves as Linda Carter from the Department of Defense Inspector General's Office and James Yu, a federal prosecutor specializing in public corruption cases. "Miss Mitchell," Senator Morrison began once everyone was seated, "thank you for coming. I know the past 6 weeks have been difficult for you." "That's an understatement," Sarah replied, deciding honesty was the only path forward. "I've been harassed, threatened, had my finances attacked, my professional reputation smeared, and my private medical information leaked online, all because I kept a promise to my dying grandfather and exposed a 56-year-old cover-up." Morrison nodded sympathetically. "Which is precisely why we asked for this meeting. We've been conducting a parallel investigation into General Ashford's conduct, not just in the Webb case, but throughout his career. What we found is extensive." James Yu leaned forward, opening a thick folder. "Miss Mitchell, when you exposed the Webb cover-up, you didn't just bring down one general. You opened a door into a network of corruption, illegal operations, and cover-ups that span 5 decades and involve dozens of high-ranking military and civilian officials. Sarah felt her stomach drop. I just wanted to clear Captain Webb's name. I know, you said gently, but the evidence you uncovered has given us leverage to investigate things that have been buried for generations. Unfortunately, that means the people involved in those cover-ups now see you as a threat. Linda Carter from the IG's office pulled out her own files. We've traced the harassment campaign against you. It's being coordinated by a private security firm called Sentinel Strategic Solutions. They specialize in reputation management and opposition research, which is corporate speak for destroying people who threaten their clients' interests. Who's their client? Chen asked, his journalist instincts immediately engaged. That's where it gets complicated, Carter replied. The contracts are routed through shell companies and offshore accounts, but we've found connections to 3 retired generals, 2 defense contractors, and a lobbying firm with deep ties to the intelligence community. All of them have something to lose if investigations continue into operations Ashford was involved with. Rebecca spoke up, her voice shaking slightly. Are you saying my father's case is just the tip of something much larger? Yes, Senator Morrison confirmed. Captain Webb refused an illegal order and was destroyed for it. But our investigation suggests that wasn't an isolated incident. There were other soldiers who spoke up about illegal activities, war crimes, and corruption, and many of them faced similar retaliation. Some were court-martialed on false charges. Others had their careers destroyed through manufactured scandals. A few died under suspicious circumstances. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Sarah found her voice. How many others? You consulted his notes. We've identified at least 47 cases over a 50-year period where soldiers or officers who reported illegal activities faced severe retaliation that appears coordinated and systematic. Your grandfather's documentation of the Webb case is the first hard evidence we've found that proves the pattern. 47 people, Sarah whispered. 47 families destroyed. At minimum, Carter added, those are just the cases we can document. There are likely many more who were too afraid to report anything in the first place or whose evidence was successfully suppressed. Catherine Simmons had been quiet, listening carefully. Now she spoke. What exactly are you proposing? Because my client has already paid a heavy price for her courage, and I'm not comfortable with her being used as bait for a larger investigation unless she's protected and compensated appropriately. Morrison nodded. Fair point. Here's what we're offering. First, full federal protection for Miss Mitchell, Miss Webb-Martinez, and Mr. Chen. That means 24/7 security, monitored communications, and immediate response to any threats. Second, we fast-track legal action against Sentinel Strategic Solutions and anyone we can prove was involved in the harassment campaign. Third, we establish a compensation fund for Miss Mitchell's expenses and damages, plus recognition of her contribution to uncovering this corruption. And in exchange? Simmons asked. We need Miss Mitchell to testify before Congress about what she found and what she's experienced since going public. We need her to be the face of this investigation, to help us build public support for a comprehensive review of military justice cases going back 50 years. Sarah felt the weight of what they were asking. She'd wanted to honor her grandfather's memory and clear Captain Webb's name. Now they wanted her to become the symbol of a massive institutional reform effort. I need to think about it, she said. Of course, but Miss Mitchell, I want you to understand something. These people who are coming after you won't stop just because you go quiet. They see you as a threat that needs to be neutralized. The only way to truly protect yourself is to bring everything into the light so completely that they can't operate in shadows anymore. After the meeting ended, Sarah, Rebecca, and Chen stood outside the building as rain continued to fall, watching black SUVs and taxis navigate DC traffic. What are you going to do? Rebecca asked quietly.
Sarah thought about her grandfather's journal, about the 53 years he'd lived with guilt and fear.
about Captain Webb who'd chosen principle over safety and paid the ultimate price, about the 47 other families who'd suffered in silence. "I'm going to testify," she said finally, "but not just about what I found. I want to tell my grandfather's story, all of it. The drinking, the failed marriages, the nightmares. I want people to understand what silence costs, what carrying these secrets does to people." Chen pulled out his phone. "I'll set up the security protocols. And Sarah, you're not alone in this. There are a lot of people who want to see this through." As they prepared to leave, Sarah's phone buzzed. An unknown number. She'd learned to dread unknown numbers, but something made her answer. "Miss Mitchell?" An elderly male voice, slightly accented. "My name is David Ortega. I served with your grandfather in Vietnam." Sarah's heart stopped. Ortega, the name from her grandfather's journal, the other witness who'd been there on November 7th, 1968. "Mr. Ortega, I tried to find you." "I know. I've been following the news about Captain Webb's exoneration. Miss Mitchell, I need to meet with you. There are things I need to tell you, things even your grandfather didn't know. Things about why the cover-up went so deep." "Where are you?" "I'm in Albuquerque. I'm 76 years old and I have stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors give me maybe 3 months. Before I die, I need to clear my conscience. I need to tell someone what really happened that day and in the days after. Your grandfather tried to protect me by keeping my name mostly out of his journal, but I was more involved than he knew." Sarah looked at Chen and Rebecca, who were watching her curiously. "Mr. Ortega, can you come to Washington? There are people here who need to hear your story." A long pause. "Miss Mitchell, if I come to Washington, I might not make it back home alive. There are people who've spent 56 years making sure I stayed quiet. But I'm dying anyway, so what do I have to lose?" "Yes, I'll come. But I want protection, and I want everything I say recorded and preserved. If they kill me for telling the truth, I want to make damn sure that truth survives anyway." "I'll arrange it," Sarah promised. "Mr. Ortega, why now? Why come forward after all these years?" Another pause, longer this time. "Because I watched you on the news, standing beside Rebecca Webb Martinez at her father's exoneration ceremony. I saw how much courage it took for you to expose this, and I thought about how I've been a coward for 56 years while good people suffered. Your grandfather found courage at the end of his life. Maybe I can too." After ending the call, Sarah relayed the information to Chen and Rebecca. "This could be exactly what we need," Chen said excitedly. "Another witness, corroborating everything, possibly with new information. But he's right to be scared. If he knows things that expand the scope of the cover-up, then the people behind it will do whatever it takes to keep him quiet," Rebecca finished grimly. Sarah immediately called Catherine Simmons and relayed the information. Within an hour, arrangements were being made to bring David Ortega to Washington under federal protection. That night, Sarah lay awake in the hotel room that had become her temporary residence. Her grandfather's house no longer felt safe, and she couldn't afford to keep running. She thought about how her life had changed completely in just 3 months. From a struggling ER nurse worried about car payments to the center of a massive corruption investigation that threatened powerful people and institutions. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Ortega is a dead man. So are you if you don't back off. Last warning." She screenshotted the message and forwarded it to the FBI contact she'd been assigned. Then she texted back, "Come find me. I'm not hiding anymore." It was reckless, maybe even stupid, but she was done being afraid. 3 days later, Sarah sat in a secure conference room at an undisclosed location, watching as David Ortega was wheeled in by federal marshals. The cancer had ravaged him. He was gaunt, pale,
connected to portable oxygen. But his eyes were clear and sharp, and when he saw Sarah, he smiled. "You look like your grandmother. Bobby showed me pictures once. Long time ago. You have her eyes." Sarah took his hand gently. "Thank you for coming. Call me David, and I should thank you. You did what Bobby and I should have done 56 years ago." Present in the room were Senator Morrison, Prosecutor Yu, several DOD investigators, Marcus Chen with recording equipment, and Rebecca Webb Martinez. David Ortega had agreed to have his testimony recorded and transcribed. Once everyone was settled, Yu began. "Mr. Ortega, can you state your full name and military service record for the record?" Staff Sergeant David Antonio Ortega, United States Army, 1st Cavalry Division, 1967 to 1970. Service number 546-789234. And you were present at Landing Zone Falcon on November 7, 1968. I was on perimeter security with Bobby Chen when Captain Webb's helicopter came in hot. We saw and heard everything that happened. Can you describe what you witnessed?
Ortega took a deep breath, his oxygen tank hissing softly. Captain Webb came in fast, unscheduled. He was screaming before the rotors even stopped. His crew chief had been shot, and Webb was saying Colonel Ashford had done it. Webb said Ashford had ordered him to fire on a civilian village displaying surrender flags. Webb had refused, and Ashford shot the crew chief and threatened to shoot Webb too. This matched Bobby Chen's journal exactly. But then Ortega continued. What Bobby didn't know, what I never told him, was that I had seen Ashford the week before, during a different operation. We cleared a village that was supposed to be Viet Cong controlled. Turned out it was just civilians, old people, women, and children. After we realized the mistake, Ashford ordered us to plant weapons and report it as a successful enemy engagement. When one of our guys, a kid named Henderson, objected, Ashford had him transferred out that night. Henderson died 2 weeks later in an ambush the intel said shouldn't have happened in that sector. The room went deadly quiet. Are you saying Colonel Ashford arranged for this soldier's death? You asked carefully. I'm saying Henderson objected to a war crime, got transferred to a unit operating in a different sector, and died in an ambush in an area that should have been clear, according to our intelligence. Could be coincidence, but after what happened with Captain Webb, I stopped believing in coincidences. Senator Morrison leaned forward. Mr. Ortega, why didn't you report this at the time? Ortega's eyes filled with tears. Because I was 22 years old and terrified. Because I'd watched what happened to Webb, court-martialed and imprisoned in 3 days. Because Henderson was dead. Because Ashford had the power to destroy anyone who crossed him, and I wanted to survive long enough to get home. Did anyone else know about the Henderson incident? You asked. Major General Westwood knew it. He was investigating it when Webb's case happened. I think that's why he sealed the evidence from Webb's helicopter instead of destroying it. He was collecting proof, but didn't have enough yet to take on Ashford and whoever was protecting him. And then Westwick died in 1985, officially from a heart attack. Officially, Ortega repeated, his tone heavy with implication. Rebecca spoke up, her voice shaking. How many? How many people did Ashford destroy or kill? Ortega looked at her with infinite sadness. I don't know for certain, but I kept track over the years, watching news about the unit, tracking names. At least a dozen soldiers from our battalion alone died under suspicious circumstances or had their careers destroyed after questioning Ashford's orders. And that's just one battalion over 2 years. Ashford served for 30 years and commanded multiple units. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about one wrongfully convicted captain. It was about a systematic pattern of retaliation, corruption, and possibly murder that had spanned decades. Yu was already making notes. Mr. Ortega, we're going to need names, dates, unit assignments, everything you remember, and we'll need to cross-reference it with military records and casualty reports. I brought something. Ortega gestured to a folder one of the marshals held. I've kept records for 56 years. Names, dates, circumstances, everything I could document without making it obvious I was investigating. I knew someday this might matter. Over the next 4 hours, David Ortega methodically detailed a pattern of corruption that painted James Ashford not as an isolated bad actor, but as someone who'd built a network of loyalists who covered for each other, eliminated threats, and advanced through the ranks by ensuring silence through fear. But perhaps most explosive was what Ortega revealed about why the cover-up had been so successful for so long. Ashford wasn't working alone, Ortega explained, his voice growing weaker as exhaustion set in. He had protection from higher up. I heard rumors, never confirmed, that Ashford was involved in operations that were off-book, things that plausibly deniable operations that higher-ranking officers and civilian officials needed done but couldn't officially sanction. As long as Ashford was useful, he was protected, and anyone who threatened to expose him threatened to expose the whole network. Do you have names? Names of who was protecting him? Rumors and suspicions, nothing concrete, but I can tell you who benefited from Ashford's silence. Several high-ranking officers who served with him went on to become generals themselves. A couple transitioned to defense contractors after retirement, and at least one became a senator. The room erupted in urgent conversation. If Ortega was right, this wasn't just a military corruption scandal. It potentially implicated current serving officials and powerful interests. The harassment you've experienced so far will look mild compared to what's coming.
Sarah nodded slowly. I know, but how can I stop now? If we walk away, all those soldiers who died or had their lives destroyed, they stay buried. The people responsible stay in power. Nothing changes. I'm not suggesting you stop, Simmons clarified. I'm making sure you understand the price you're paying. Because once you testify before Congress and this becomes public, there's no going back to a normal life. You'll always be the woman who exposed military corruption. That will follow you forever. My grandfather lived with silence for 53 years, and it destroyed him. I'd rather live with the consequences of speaking up than the consequences of staying quiet. Simmons studied her for a long moment, then nodded. All right, then let's make sure your testimony counts. We have 2 weeks to prepare before the congressional hearing. We need to make this airtight, documented, and impossible to dismiss. That evening, as Sarah returned to her hotel under federal protection, she found Rebecca waiting in the lobby. I couldn't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I think about what David said. My father wasn't the only one. There were so many others. They went up to Sarah's room and sat talking late into the night. 2 women connected by a helicopter, a 56-year-old crime, and a shared determination to see justice done no matter the cost. Do you ever regret it? Buying that helicopter? Opening this door? Sarah thought about her empty bank account, her disrupted career, the constant fear and harassment, the loss of privacy and normalcy. No, she said finally, because if I hadn't, your grandfather would still be remembered as a coward, David Ortega would die without clearing his conscience, and all those other soldiers would stay forgotten. Sometimes doing the right thing costs everything, but that doesn't make it not worth doing. Rebecca wiped tears from her eyes. My father would have liked you. He would have been proud that his story inspired someone like you to fight back. As Rebecca left and Sarah prepared for bed, she checked her email one file time. Among the usual mix of support messages and death threats was one from an address she didn't recognize, with a subject line that made her blood run cold. Your grandfather didn't die from cancer. Sarah's hand trembled as she opened it. Miss Mitchell, my name is Dr. Robert Harrison. I was a VA oncologist who treated your grandfather. I've been following the news about Captain Webb's exoneration, and I believe you deserve to know the truth about how your grandfather died. His cancer was aggressive, but it wasn't natural. Certain markers in his blood work suggested exposure to carcinogens that aren't common in civilian life. At the time, I reported my concerns to my supervisors, but was told to drop it and not include my suspicions in any official reports. I've lived with that silence for 3 years. If you're willing to meet, I have documentation. But be careful. I've already survived 1 accident since your story went public. Sarah forwarded the email immediately, to you, to Simmons, to Chen, to everyone on her protection team. Her grandfather hadn't just carried the burden of silence for 53 years, he'd been murdered for finally deciding to speak up. And the people who'd killed him were still out there, still dangerous, still willing to do whatever it took to keep their secrets buried.
Sarah stared at her ceiling in the dark, knowing sleep wouldn't come. In 2 weeks, she would stand before Congress and tell the whole story. Webb, Henderson, the 47 documented cases of retaliation, Ortega's revelations, and now possibly her grandfather's murder. She thought about the text message she'd received. Last warning. No, Sarah thought. No more warnings. No more silence. No more fear. They laughed when she bought a rusty helicopter. Now they were going to learn why that laughter had been premature. Because that helicopter had opened a door to truth that couldn't be closed anymore, no matter how powerful the people trying to shut it. The fight was just beginning. And Sarah Mitchell, the trauma nurse who just wanted to honor her dying grandfather's wish, was about to become the most dangerous witness against military corruption in American history. The morning of the congressional hearing, Sarah awoke at 4 a.m. in her secured hotel room, her heart already racing. She'd barely slept, running through her testimony in her mind, anticipating hostile questions, preparing herself for what Catherine Simmons had warned would be a crucible. Her phone showed 63 missed calls overnight, all from blocked numbers. The voicemails ranged from death threats to offers of money to bribes disguised as consulting opportunities. One message, from a woman claiming to be a military widow, begged Sarah to stop dishonoring the sacrifices of real heroes. The psychological warfare had been relentless, but today it would end one way or another. By 6 a.m., Sarah was dressed in the conservative Navy suit Simmons had insisted she wear. "You need to look credible, not defiant," the lawyer had advised. In the mirror, Sarah barely recognized herself. 3 months ago, she'd been an exhausted ER nurse in scrubs. Now she looked like someone who belonged in Washington power circles. Except she didn't belong here. And that, Marcus Chen had told her, was her exact strength. "You're not one of them," Chen had said during prep sessions. "You're a regular person who stumbled into something huge and refused to look away. That authenticity is your greatest asset. Don't try to sound like a politician or a lawyer. Just tell the truth in your own words." At 7 a.m., federal marshals escorted Sarah, Rebecca, and Chen to a convoy of vehicles. David Ortega, too ill to testify in person, would appear via secure video link from an undisclosed medical facility. The drive to Capitol Hill took 20 minutes through early morning traffic. Sarah watched the city wake up, joggers on the National Mall, food trucks setting up, tourists already queuing at museum entrances. Normal life continuing while she prepared to detonate a bomb under the military establishment. The Hart Senate office building loomed imposingly, its white marble facade catching the morning sun. News vans already lined the street, satellite dishes extended, reporters practicing their opening segments. Sarah spotted at least 3 networks she recognized and several international outlets. This was going to be broadcast worldwide. "Remember," Simmons said as they entered through a secure entrance, "you're not on trial. You're a witness. Answer the questions directly and honestly. If you don't know something, say so. Don't speculate or embellish. The facts are damning enough." The hearing room, officially Committee Room 216, was massive, with raised seating for the senators, a witness table facing them, and rows of seats for media and public observers. Every seat was filled, with people standing along the walls. Sarah recognized several high-ranking military officials in uniform, their expressions stony. Defense contractors in expensive suits, advocates and activists, journalists she'd seen on television. And in the back row, trying to be inconspicuous but failing, sat several men Sarah recognized from security briefings. Associates of Sentinel Strategic Solutions, the firm that had been coordinating the harassment against her. They were here, watching, assessing, probably reporting back to whoever was paying them. Senator Patricia Morrison gavelled the hearing to order at precisely 9 a.m. The room fell silent. "This hearing of the Senate Armed Services Committee is called to order," Morrison announced, her voice carrying authority. "Today we examine allegations of systemic corruption, wrongful prosecution, and retaliation within the United States military justice system, spanning 5 decades. Our primary witness is Miss Sarah Mitchell, a civilian nurse who uncovered evidence of these activities while investigating her grandfather's military service. Morrison paused, looking directly at Sarah. Miss Mitchell, before we begin, I want to acknowledge your courage in coming forward despite significant personal cost. The harassment and intimidation you've experienced are unacceptable and are themselves under federal investigation. You are here voluntarily, and you have the full protection of this committee and federal law enforcement. Sarah nodded, her throat tight. Please stand and raise your right hand, Morrison instructed. Sarah stood, her legs steadier than she had expected. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you are about to give before this committee is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do. Please be seated. Miss Mitchell, I'll turn the floor over to you for your opening statement. Sarah had prepared a statement with Simmons's help, but looking at the assembled crowd, the military officials who'd built careers on silence, the contractors who profited from secrecy, the politicians who'd looked the other way, she set aside her notes. 3 months ago, she began, her voice finding strength as she spoke, I was a struggling ER nurse facing financial crisis. My grandfather had just died, leaving me a property I didn't want and debts I couldn't pay. The last thing on my mind was investigating military corruption or exposing cover-ups. She paused, making eye contact with people in the audience. But my grandfather, Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, had carried a secret for 53 years. He'd witnessed something in Vietnam, something that haunted him his entire life. On his deathbed, he made me promise to finish what he couldn't. He told me about Captain Marcus Webb, a helicopter pilot who'd been wrongfully convicted and imprisoned for refusing an illegal order. Sarah pulled out a photograph, the one she had found in her grandfather's study, and held it up. This is my grandfather in 1968, standing beside David Ortega. They were both 20 years old, serving their country in a war that would change them forever. On November 7, 1968, they witnessed a colonel, later General James Ashford, shoot an enlisted man and threaten to kill a helicopter pilot who refused to fire on civilians displaying surrender flags. Murmurs rippled through the room. My grandfather and Mr. Ortega kept silent about what they saw. They were young, they were afraid, and they'd watched Captain Webb get court-martialed in 3 days and sent to prison for 20 years. They understood that speaking up meant being destroyed. Sarah's voice grew stronger. For 53 years, my grandfather lived with that silence. It contributed to his alcoholism, destroyed his marriages, gave him nightmares that never stopped. He died believing he was a coward for not speaking up. She pulled out her grandfather's journal, holding it up. But he wasn't a coward. He was a young man facing an impossible situation. And before he died, he documented everything. He tracked the helicopter, serial number 681572, for years, waiting for it to appear at public auction so someone could finally access the evidence sealed inside it.
Sarah described the auction, the mockery, spending her life savings on what everyone thought was worthless junk. She described finding the sealed compartment with 56-year-old evidence that completely exonerated Captain Webb and proved General Ashford had committed war crimes. Then she described what had followed, the break-in, the threats, the systematic harassment campaign designed to destroy her financially and professionally. But here's what they didn't count on, Sarah said, her voice ringing clear. They didn't count on David Ortega coming forward after 56 years of silence. They didn't count on us discovering that Captain Webb's case wasn't isolated. There are at least 47 documented cases of soldiers being wrongfully accused or punished for reporting illegal activities. And they didn't count on evidence that my grandfather's cancer, which killed him 3 weeks before he could see this through, may not have been natural. That statement caused an uproar.
Morrison had to gavel for order. Sarah pulled out a printed email. Dr. Robert Harrison, a VA oncologist, contacted me 3 weeks ago. He treated my grandfather and found markers suggesting exposure to carcinogens that aren't common in civilian life. When he reported his concerns, he was told to stay quiet and not include his suspicions in official reports. She looked directly at the military officials in the room. My grandfather kept your secrets for 53 years, and when he finally decided to tell the truth, I believe he was murdered for it. The room exploded. Reporters were already typing furiously. Military officials were conferring urgently. Morrison gavelled repeatedly for order. When silence finally returned, Morrison spoke carefully. Ms. Mitchell, that is a serious allegation. Do you have proof beyond Dr. Harrison's suspicions? Federal prosecutors are investigating. But, Senator, here's what I know for certain. My grandfather was afraid of speaking up his entire life. When he finally found the courage, he died before he could follow through. That could be coincidence, but given everything else we've discovered, the systematic retaliation, the harassment campaign against me, the attempts to suppress this evidence, I don't believe in coincidences anymore. Senator Walsh, who'd been silent until now, leaned forward. Miss Mitchell, let's talk about the evidence you found in that helicopter. You claim it exonerates Captain Webb, but how can we trust that evidence hasn't been tampered with over 56 years? Sarah had expected this question. Sir, the evidence was sealed in military evidence bags with tamper-evident seals dated November 1968. Those seals were intact when we opened the compartment. The materials inside, flight recorder tapes, radio recordings, maintenance logs, photographs, and witness statements have all been examined by forensic experts. The National Archives authenticated them. The audio restoration was done by specialists at the Library of Congress. Everything checks out. But you had access to the helicopter for several hours before authorities arrived. You could have planted that evidence. Sarah felt a flash of anger but kept her voice level. Senator, with respect, I'm an ER nurse, not a forensic expert or Hollywood special effects artist. I wouldn't know how to fake 56-year-old military documents, authentic 1968 audio recordings, and photographs that match Pentagon archives. Moreover, everything we found is consistent with records from Major General Westwick's investigation, records that were sealed in military archives long before I was born. Walsh started to respond, but Morrison cut him off. Senator, if you're suggesting Miss Mitchell fabricated evidence, I think you should say so explicitly rather than insinuating. Otherwise, let's focus on what the evidence actually shows. Over the next 3 hours, Sarah answered questions from senators, some sympathetic, others clearly hostile. She was questioned about her grandfather's mental state. He was lucid and detailed in his journal entries, her own motivations, to honor his memory and clear Captain Webb's name, and her relationship with investigative journalists. Mr. Chen contacted me after I sent evidence to multiple news outlets. Then David Ortega appeared via video link, his face gaunt on the large screen, oxygen tube visible. Mr. Ortega, Morrison began gently, thank you for joining us. We understand you're dealing with serious health issues. I'm dying, Senator, Ortega said bluntly. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors give me weeks, maybe days, which is why I'm here. I've been silent for 56 years. I'm not dying silent. For the next hour, Ortega methodically described everything he'd witnessed, not just the Webb incident, but the Henderson case, the pattern of retaliation, and the network of officers who protected each other. His testimony was devastating in its detail and credibility. Mr. Ortega, one senator asked, why should we believe you now when you've admitted you stayed silent for over half a century? Ortega's expression hardened. Because I have nothing to gain by lying. I'm dying.
I have no pension to protect, no career to salvage, no reputation to defend. I'm here because I owe it to Captain Webb, to Private Henderson, to Bobby Chen, and to every soldier who was destroyed for trying to do the right thing. I'm here because silence has rotted my soul for 56 years, and I want to die clean." The room was utterly silent. Then came the bombshell moment that would dominate news coverage for weeks. Senator Morrison called a surprise witness, Colonel William Hayes, the retired officer who'd broken into Sarah's property and threatened her. Hayes entered the room flanked by lawyers, his military bearing intact, but his expression suggesting he'd rather be anywhere else. "Colonel Hayes," Morrison began, "you are appearing under subpoena. You've been granted limited immunity for your testimony today in exchange for full cooperation. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "Colonel Hayes, did you break into Miss Mitchell's property on the evening of June 16, 2025? A long pause. "Yes, ma'am." "On whose orders?" Hayes glanced at his lawyers, who nodded. "I was contracted by Sentinel Strategic Solutions to retrieve classified materials from a helicopter that had been improperly sold at public auction." "Who hired Sentinel Strategic Solutions?" "I don't have direct knowledge of that." Morrison pulled out documents. "Colonel Hayes, we have bank records showing payments from shell companies linked to 3 retired generals, 2 defense contractors, and a lobbying firm. We have emails between you and these entities discussing asset recovery and witness management. Are you telling this committee you don't know who you were working for?" Hayes's jaw tightened. "I received orders through intermediaries. I was told this was a matter of national security." "Was it standard national security protocol to break into a civilian's home, fire weapons at her, and threaten her family?" "Ma'am, the situation was escalating. We believed Miss Mitchell had accessed classified materials that could compromise ongoing operations." "What operations?" Morrison demanded. "The Vietnam War ended 50 years ago. What could possibly still be classified?" Hayes looked distinctly uncomfortable. "Ma'am, some operations from that era involved activities that, if disclosed, could damage current diplomatic relations and implicate individuals who are still serving in various capacities." "So you're admitting there are ongoing cover-ups?" "I'm saying there are legitimate national security concerns." Senator Morrison leaned forward. "Colonel Hayes, let me be very clear. This committee has reviewed the evidence from that helicopter. There is nothing in it that constitutes a current national security threat. What it does contain is evidence of war crimes, wrongful prosecution, and corruption. The only people threatened by its disclosure are those who committed or covered up those crimes. Now, I'm going to ask you again, who ordered you to intimidate and threaten Miss Mitchell?" Hayes sat in stubborn silence. Morrison's expression hardened. "Your immunity agreement requires full cooperation. If you refuse to answer, you will be held in contempt of Congress and face criminal charges for breaking and entering, assault, and witness intimidation. Choose wisely, Colonel." The room held its breath. Finally, Hayes spoke. "The orders came through General Richard Thornton, retired. He represented a group of former officers and defense contractors who had concerns about the information Miss Mitchell was uncovering." "And why were they concerned?" "Because the Webb case isn't isolated. There are other incidents, other cover-ups. If one domino falls, they all fall, and some of those dominoes are currently serving senators, congressmen, Pentagon officials, and CEOs of major corporations." The room erupted. Morrison gavelled for order, but the revelation was out. This wasn't just about one wrongful conviction 56 years ago. It was about a network of corruption that extended into the present day. As the hearing continued through the afternoon, witness after witness came forward.
a former military prosecutor who'd been pressured to drop investigations, a JAG officer who'd been transferred for questioning irregularities in court-martial proceedings, family members of soldiers who died under suspicious circumstances after reporting illegal activities. By the time the hearing finally adjourned at 6 p.m., the damage to the military establishment's credibility was catastrophic. Within hours, calls for investigations were coming from the White House, the Pentagon, and advocacy groups worldwide. That evening, Sarah sat in a secure conference room with Chen, Rebecca, Simmons, and an exhausted-looking David Ortega, who'd been transported to a D.C. hospital for monitoring. "You did it," Chen said quietly. "You actually did it." "Did what? Expose corruption? Sure. But what changes? Will there be real accountability or just some scapegoats and congressional reports that get buried?" "That's up to us to keep pushing," Rebecca said. "My father's name is cleared, but there are 46 other families still waiting for justice. We can't stop now." Ortega, looking more fragile than ever, spoke up. "I'll be dead soon, but I want you all to know, telling the truth today was the first time in 56 years I've felt like a soldier instead of a coward. Whatever happens next, I can die with that." 3 days later, David Ortega passed away peacefully in his sleep. His family released a statement. David carried the burden of silence for too long. He died relieved that the truth was finally told. The aftermath of the hearing was seismic. General Ashford, who'd maintained silence throughout the entire scandal, released a brief statement through lawyers claiming the allegations were unfounded attacks on a decorated veteran. But within a week, documents emerged showing Ashford had received payments from several of the shell companies linked to the cover-up efforts. His publisher dropped him. His consulting contracts were terminated. Congressional representatives who'd accepted his campaign contributions scrambled to distance themselves.
More significantly, the Pentagon announced a comprehensive review of military justice cases going back 50 years, with a special focus on soldiers who'd reported illegal activities and subsequently faced court-martial or suspicious deaths. Sarah returned to California, to her grandfather's property, where the helicopter now sat protected as historical evidence. Standing before it one morning, she thought about the journey, from a reluctant inheritance to a catalyst for systemic change. Her phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. After months of threats, she'd learned to be wary, but something made her answer. "Miss Mitchell?" An elderly woman's voice. "My name is Margaret Henderson. My son was Private First Class Thomas Henderson. He served with your grandfather in Vietnam and died in 1968. I just watched your testimony. I need to know if you can help me find out what really happened to my boy." Sarah closed her eyes, thinking of David Ortega's testimony about Henderson questioning Ashford's orders and dying shortly after. "Mrs. Henderson, I'll do everything I can to help you find those answers." Over the following weeks, Sarah was contacted by dozens of families. Soldiers who disappeared, careers destroyed, lives ruined for speaking up. Each one represented another piece of the massive cover-up that was finally crumbling. 6 months after the congressional hearing, Sarah stood before a very different gathering. The National Veterans Memorial was hosting a ceremony to honor soldiers who'd been wrongfully accused or retaliated against for reporting illegal activities. Captain Marcus Webb's name was being added to the memorial, along with 42 others whose cases had been reviewed and exonerated. Rebecca stood beside Sarah, tears streaming down her face as her father's name was unveiled in bronze. But Sarah's attention was drawn to a separate section being dedicated. "In memory of those who chose conscience over career, truth over silence." Her grandfather's name was there. David Ortega's, Thomas Henderson's, and dozens of others. Tan Marcus appeared beside her. "Your documentary premiered last night. 20 million viewers. It's already won 3 journalism awards." Sarah nodded. The documentary, The Helicopter Secret,
How one woman exposed 50 years of military corruption was Chen's project, but Sarah had participated extensively. It was thorough, damning, and had sparked calls for criminal investigations. General Ashford was indicted this morning: perjury, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. 3 other former generals were also charged. This is really happening, Sarah. Real accountability. What about the one still in power? Sarah asked. Hayes mentioned current officials. Federal prosecutors are working on it, but that's going to take time. The important thing is the system is being forced to confront its failures. That evening, Sarah returned to her grandfather's house, her house now. She'd decided to keep it, to turn part of it into a resource center for military families seeking justice. The property that had once been a burden was now a symbol of resilience. She sat at her grandfather's desk, the journal open before her, and began writing her own entry. Dear Grandpa Bobby, you told me to finish what you couldn't. I think I have. Captain Webb's name is cleared. David Ortega died knowing he'd finally told the truth. 43 families have gotten answers about their loved ones, and the system that protected corruption for so long is being forced to change. I understand now why you stayed silent for so long. Fear is powerful, but I also understand why you finally spoke up, because living with truth, even when it's hard, is better than dying with secrets. I bought that helicopter everyone laughed at, and in doing so, I learned that sometimes the most worthwhile things look like mistakes at first. That courage isn't the absence of fear, it's keeping promises despite being terrified. That one person really can make a difference, even against systems that seem too powerful to challenge. I hope wherever you are, you know your burden is lifted, your silence is broken, and your granddaughter finished what you started. Love, Sarah. She closed the journal and looked at the photograph on the wall, her grandfather and David Ortega, young and optimistic before war and corruption stole their innocence. They'd laughed when she bought a rusty helicopter. But that helicopter held more than rust and broken parts. It held testimony that couldn't be silenced, evidence that couldn't be destroyed, truth that couldn't be buried forever. And sometimes, truth is worth every penny, every threat, every sacrifice required to bring it into the light. Sarah Mitchell had learned that lesson. Epilogue. 1 year later. The award ceremony at the National Press Club was everything Sarah had never wanted: attention, accolades, and recognition. But as she accepted the John F. Kennedy Profile of Courage Award, she thought about the people who should have been there. Her grandfather, David Ortega, Captain Webb, Thomas Henderson, and the 40-plus others whose courage had cost them everything. I didn't do this for awards, Sarah said in her acceptance speech. I did it because my grandfather asked me to keep a promise. But what I learned is that courage is contagious. When one person speaks up, it gives others permission to do the same. David Ortega had been silent for 56 years until he saw me refuse to back down. Then he found his voice, and his testimony opened the door for dozens of other witnesses.
She paused, looking at the assembled journalists, activists, and officials. The people who laughed when I bought that helicopter taught me something important. Society often mocks what it doesn't understand. They saw rust and junk. I saw evidence and truth. They saw a foolish waste of money. I saw justice waiting to be claimed. Sarah held up the award. This belongs to everyone who chose truth over comfort, who kept promises even when it cost them everything, who believed that doing the right thing matters even when the odds are impossible. The standing ovation lasted several minutes. Later, Rebecca found Sarah outside, escaping the crowd. My daughter asked me today what her grandfather was like, Rebecca said. For the first time in my life, I could tell her he was a hero. Not the manufactured kind, but the real kind. Someone who chose principle over survival. Thank you for giving me that gift.
Sarah hugged her. He gave it to himself by refusing that order. We just made sure the world finally knew. As Sarah drove home that night, past the Smithsonian, where her grandfather's journal was now preserved, past the Pentagon, where reforms were being implemented, past the countless monuments to military service, she thought about how one decision, one impulsive purchase at an auction, had changed everything. She'd lost her savings, but gained a purpose. She'd faced threats, but found courage. She'd bought a rusty helicopter and discovered that sometimes the most valuable things don't look valuable at all. They just need someone willing to see beyond the rust, beyond the mockery, beyond the fear. Someone willing to keep a promise no matter the cost. And in doing so, change the world.